Okay, in lesson 2 of labor mobility, chapter 8, we're going to look at the same model that we did in lesson 1, but in lesson 2, the two groups of workers, native-born workers, and undocumented workers are perfect substitutes. Okay, so we're going to change that assumption. Instead of perfect complements, to perfect substitutes. Okay. Now, I copied in the labor demand curve and the labor supply curve into Desmos. I did that on a second Desmos sheet. I have two Desmos sheets here. And then I already entered in the equilibrium employment level and the competitive market wage rate, right? So for the undocumented immigrants, workers, 86,000 of them, right, are employed at a wage of $6.92 an hour. For the native-born workers, 90,000 of them are employed at a wage of $11.13. So I already entered those things in. The intercept of the native labor demand curve implies that firms are willing to pay up to $15.63 for that first native-born worker hired. The intercept of the native labor supply curve implies that a native worker, at least one of them, has a reservation wage of at least 6.63, right? The reservation wage of the last native worker hired and the most firms are willing to pay the last native worker hired, in this case, the 90th one, right, is $11.13 an hour. So the last worker hired and the firm that hires that last worker, they're the marginal, the marginal firm and the marginal worker, right? And we do the same thing for the undocumented workers. The intercept of the undocumented worker labor demand curve, 11.22, is the amount of money, wage, it's the wage that firms are willing to pay the first undocumented worker, right? The intercept of the labor supply curve is the reservation wage of at least one undocumented worker, in this case, 262, right? Then the reservation wage of the last undocumented worker hired and the wage firms are willing to pay that last undocumented worker hired is the market wage rate of 6.92. Suppose that undocumented and native workers are perfect substitutes. Three isoquants are shown in the diagram below. There are a lot more than that, but we're just showing three of them. The highest one corresponds to an output of 627. The middle one corresponds to an output of 495. And the one on the bottom corresponds to an output of 330. What is not shown is the isocost line. And it's going to pass through the cost minimizing level of undocumented and native workers. The slope of that line is the ratio of the market wages for both labor markets. And since undocumented workers employment levels on the x-axis, the isocost slope is the wage of undocumented workers, which is 692, divided by the wage of the market wage of native-born workers, which is 1113. And so the slope of that isocost line that's going to reveal the cost minimizing level, the slope is 0.62, right? The cost minimizing number, according to this diagram, of undocumented workers equals 86,000 and native workers 90,000. Notice that on isoquant 495, the blue line, point U is preferred by employers because it represents even lower labor cost. The light green line is closer to the origin than the dark green line. So the light green line represents lower cost than the dark green line, right? But this light green line and point U are not attainable due to immigration law, restricting the quantity of undocumented worker labor supply to just 86,000. If firms could hire 176,000 undocumented workers, point U, at $692, right? $6.92 per hour to 176 undocumented workers, plus the wage rate paid to native-born workers times, at point U, 0 native-born workers are hired. So labor costs would be $1,217.92 if firms could get to point U, but they can't. Instead, at point O, their labor cost total to what? So they're at point O instead. They'd like to be at point U, but they can't. So they're at point O, right? So point O, they're hiring only 86 undocumented workers, and then they're hiring 90 native-born workers. And that represents labor cost equal to $1,596.82 per hour, right? With the market price of the product supplied, each unit that the firm produces can be sold at $324. The firm is producing $495. So the revenue generated at anywhere along this blue line is $1,603.80, right, per hour. The economic profit is the difference between it and the cost. Here's the labor cost. And the profit is $698. Okay, so we're at point O. We can't be down here at point U where the firms want to be. Now, to stem the flow of migration even further, steep penalties on employers who break immigration law were imposed. If a substantial increase in the penalties for hiring undocumented workers reduced the number of undocumented workers by 40, then the number of workers in the undocumented labor market would what? So it's going to decrease the number of undocumented workers from 86 by 40, right? So we got to subtract 86 and 40. So we end up with 46,000 undocumented workers, right? So the number of workers in the undocumented labor market would reduce to 46,000. Reduces by 40,000, right? And it reduces to 46,000 from 86,000, right? This would result in an undocumented worker market wage of what? Well, this is the labor demand curve that results, right? You see it up here. The labor demand curve shifts inward to this purple graph, right? As a result, undocumented employment level falls as along with the wage that is paid to undocumented workers, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to copy this this equation for that line up here. We're going to copy it into Desmos, right? So I'm going to add I'm going to add one after here. I'm going to add a line right here. I'm going to change the color to purple. Okay. And I'm going to click on this to get the new wage rate. The new wage rate is $4.92. It's just under $5 an hour, right? So it's just under $5 an hour. It's $4.92 per hour. And only 46 undocumented workers are able to get a job. 46,000, right? The result of the enhanced penalties will also change the native employment level to what? Well, before the enhanced penalties, 90,000 native-born workers were working, right? 86 undocumented workers were working. But the enhanced penalties reduced 86 to 46, right? Reduced 86 to 46. And these workers are perfect substitutes, right? So when employers lose 40 undocumented workers, they're going to have to add 40 native born workers, and they're going to add that to the 90. So the new employment level of native born workers is 130,000. And notice what happens to the labor demand curve in the native born worker labor market. It shifts out, and the equilibrium of the new equilibrium is that 130,000 native born workers at a market wage that is looking like about 13, right? So labor demand shifts in for undocumented workers and labor demand shifts out for native born workers, right? The new labor demand for native born workers is 19.63 minus 0.05. This equation is in red, and it corresponds to that graph. So what we got to do is we got to go up here to the native born worker labor market. I'm going to change that to red to match it. The new employment level is 130. The new wage rate is 1313, right? The enhanced penalties result in a new cost minimizing number of undocumented and native workers at point R, right? So this is the new level, 46 that we got there. That's the new level of native born workers, 130, which we have there, right? So we have this new point. We're still producing 495 units, right? So the slope of the ISO cost line that's going to pass through that point, the slope is equal to the ratio of these new market wages, right? So because undocumented workers are on the x-axis, their wage rate goes in the numerator of this ratio. And their wage rate was what? Their new wage rate is 492, right? 4.92. The new wage rate of native born workers is 1313. And the slope of that ISO cost line is 0.37, right? The slope of that new ISO cost line is 0.37. And as soon as I hit enter here, I'm asking to graph it. Now it's very flat, isn't it? It's very flat here. So this is as big as the undocumented, the number of undocumented workers employed can get because of the now enhanced penalties, right? So this is as many as as American firms can hire, 46,000, right? So R is the new cost minimizing number of undocumented workers, right? That it determines that, right? And that is 46. The new number of native workers is going to be equal to 130, right? And those minimize firm cost under these enhanced restrictions. Okay. Point U is where the firms would like to be, right? They would like to be at point U. Okay. Point U and point R are still on this isoquant of 495, right? Output being 495. So point U is preferred by employers because it represents even lower labor cost, but is not attainable due to even more restrictive immigration law, limiting the quantity of undocumented workers labor supply to just 46,000, right? If firms could hire the 176, if they could hire that 176, right, at $4.92 per hour, the new market wage, right, what would their labor cost be per hour? They're hiring 0 native born workers at a wage of $13.13 an hour, right? So the labor costs would be even smaller than they were before, right? Instead of point R, their labor costs are what? Well, we have 130 native-born workers earning $13.13 an hour, and we have 46 undocumented workers making $4.92 an hour, right? So 4.92 times the 46 undocumented workers times the 13.13 per hour of the native-born workers, and 130 of them are hired at point R. That results in a cost of 1933.22 per hour. If the market price is 324 still, right? Maybe these firms that hire these workers sell a product where they face competition from companies from overseas, and the world price is 324, right? So that would explain why the price remains constant. Now their output hasn't changed. The firm's output hasn't changed. It's still 495. So the economic revenue is $1,603.80, right? At this now higher cost level, right? What are the economic profits? Well, they're actually economic losses. The economic loss is 329.42, right? So we have a negative economic profit, right? Negative economic profit. Thus, the more restrictive immigration policy increases native worker employment by 40,000, right? Remember, it increased it by 40,000 to 130. And it decreases undocumented worker employment by 40,000. If the undocumented workers who lose their jobs have no family in this country and have no means to return to their home countries, many of them may end up homeless in America. Maybe that helps explain the homelessness in California, right? In addition, the native-born worker wage increases by what? The native-born worker wage increased to $13.13 an hour from, what was it originally? It was originally $11.13, right? So it increases by $2 an hour. The undocumented worker wage declines by how much? Let's delete this stuff here. The undocumented worker wage was $6.92, right? It now is what? 4.92. So the undocumented worker wage declines by $2, which creates economic hardships for employed undocumented workers. So the undocumented workers that are able to keep their jobs, they see a huge drop off in their wage rate, which means they have lower incomes, which increases their economic hardships in the United States, which maybe makes them more reliant on charity from private citizens or charity from government in the form of food stamps and other benefits, right? Now, although the native-born workers are doing much better, right? They saw a $2 an hour, $2 per hour raise, right? Under those more restrictive immigration policies. These windfalls to them may be short-lived because the economic losses that their employers are now accruing may put those employers out of business, right? They may go to another country.